right, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tony Rice with the National Milk Producers Federation and the U.S. Dairy Export Council, and welcome to the 2022 World Dairy Expo. This morning's seminar, I guess we're in afternoon now officially, is The Future of Our Dairy Markets, What Reforms Are Needed? And it's sponsored by the National Milk Producers Federation. Our panelists today are Dana Coale, Dr. Roger Cryan, Dr. Andrew Novakovic, and Jim Sleper. Moderating today's panel is Dr. Mark Stephenson. Federal milk marketing orders have been regulating aspects of U.S. dairy markets for more than 80 years. They have evolved over time to accommodate changes in technology, consumer preferences, and structure of our industry. However, their basic tools, classified pricing and pooling, are not fundamentally different than they were in the 1940s. The panel will examine what substantial changes are needed for future U.S. dairy market regulations. Small adjustments. All right. These panelists are deeply entrenched in the agricultural finance sector with decades of experience and representation of a broad geographic area. Panelists include Dana Coale. She is the Deputy Administrator of USDA's Agricultural Marketing Services Dairy Program, where she administers the federal milk marketing orders as well as managing dairy market news reporting, development of dairy product standards, dairy quality grading and inspection, export certification program services, and oversight of the fluid milk and dairy promotion and research programs. Roger Cryan, Ph.D., Chief Economist at the American Farm Bureau Federation, is familiar with providing insight on a wide range of market and policy issues. Before joining Farm Bureau, he served as part of USDA's Agricultural Marketing Service, the National Milk Producers Federation, and the Federal Milk Marketing Administrator in Atlanta, Georgia. Andrew Novakovic, Ph.D., has focused his 45-year career on the economics of dairy markets and policy. He has worked closely with congressional and USDA staff on the analysis and development of dairy programs, specifically as a senior economist in the USDA Office of Chief Economist. Jim Sleper, managing partner of Sleper Consulting LLC, has extensive knowledge on dairy economics and policy, thanks to his prior positions at Southeast Milk, Foremost Farms USA, Land O'Lakes, Dean Foods, Milk Marketing Incorporated, and the USDA's Federal Milk Marketing Order Program. And this panel was moderated by Mark Stephenson, the recently retired Director of Dairy Policy Analysis at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Throughout his 40-year career, Dr. Stephenson conducted applied research on the impacts of dairy markets and policy at the farm, plant, and sector levels, and has worked on many projects looking at federal milk marketing orders. I'd like to ask everyone to please silence your cell phones, and I'll turn it over to Dr. Stephenson to kick us off.
Thank you. That's an important reminder. I don't want that going off either. That's really embarrassing. Just curious, how many of you folks know one or more of the people who are panelists up here? Oh, a lot of folks. Well, then you'll have some sympathy for me because this is like herding cats for sure. Not going to be easy to try to keep these in, but in and on topic. But in my role as moderator and provocateur here for the group, I'm going to throw out just a few questions to specific individuals at first, because I'd like to get some of their response to lay a foundation for what I hope we'll talk about a little bit later. So I'm going to ask Dana and start with Dana. I'm pretty sure that most of the folks who are here today don't really totally understand federal milk marketing orders. A few people would probably make that claim that they actually did. So I'm asking you to correct some of that shortcoming, but not really trying to go into great depth here. But I wonder if you can at least give us a thumbnail sketch as to what federal orders do. It's not just classified pricing and pooling.
Thank you, Mark. Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. It is great to have an opportunity to be here. I have to say, in my 34 years at USDA, working in the dairy sector, this is my first time at World Dairy Expo, so this has been fantastic. And I get to talk about federal milk marketing orders. I'm probably one of the few people that get really excited to talk about it. And the reason I get excited about it is because federal orders offer so much to the industry and to U.S. producers that people often don't realize. When I started at USDA, probably the most prominent thing related to federal orders, or what people really talked about, was just what you said, Mark, pricing and pooling. And that's really all people recognize with the federal orders. And then they'd say they're just so complicated. So what message I want to relay is, first of all, federal orders establish the terms of trade between the handlers and the producers. And that's really the key foundation of it. And through that, they do pricing, they do pooling, but there are many, many other things. And probably as we've seen the industry and the agricultural sector, and actually the whole world consolidate, some of the other key things that they provide to the industry, and particularly to producers, have become more important. And some of those things would be ensuring that you all get paid the proper amount, the verification of your weights and tests of the milk that you are actually delivering, verifying that the handlers are using the milk in accordance with what they say they are. So we're going in and we're auditing and we're verifying that usage. Very important, again, to make certain that the proper monies are returned back to the producers. Another really key thing that has become more and more important is enforcement of payment dates, ensuring that you as producers are paid at least twice a month. And if payments are not made, we enforce those provisions on the handlers. We have penalties that we assess to them. So it's really important that you get paid, because if you stop and think about it, what does most of the world pay on? 30, 60 days? We say, nope, you're gonna pay twice. This is when you're gonna make those payments. And then because we are in the plants, we're auditing, we're verifying producer payrolls, we have this wealth of data, we're able to provide that information out to you. And we do that through our various market administrator office websites. There is a wealth of information. And if you talk to others, or even if you talk to dairy farmers who are working in other sectors, one thing that they really love, Mark, is the amount of information that is available. Of course, these gentlemen like the information too, because they use it in a wealth of different ways. But those are some really key things that federal orders do way beyond the pricing and the pooling, which are two key functions. But we can't forget the many, many other aspects that federal orders bring to the industry and the things that they provide.
Oh, thanks, Dana. I mean, that's only a brief overview. I mean, you do testing, you do grading, you do just a bunch of stuff that is really important to an industry to help them function. I'm wondering if you might pass the microphone to Andy at this point in time. I am not trying to go in a particular order, but there's nobody that knows dairy history probably better than Andy, and has a great oversight, I think, of federal orders and what they are. So I would ask Andy if you can help us understand and think a little bit about what the culture was, what the problems were that federal orders were trying to solve at the time that they were being considered and put together back in the late 30s, early 40s. I think you turned off.
This is Dana saying, don't take too much time. So before I get to what Mark said and just kind of me telling you stuff, I have this quiz. Like, I'm a professor, right? So I have a quiz. How many of you grew up on a dairy farm? Lots of folks. How many of you remember your parents, some adult, maybe in a VOAG class, somebody talking about federal milk marketing orders, or the fact that there's government regulation of prices? How many could say yes to that? A few? Okay. So like, you're like the oldest guy close to me, so I'm gonna ask you, what do you remember about that? Do you remember kind of vaguely knowing something about it, or do you remember kind of getting into it? What do you recall?
Probably our OAG teacher, probably in NWTC at times had brought it up and discussed it briefly.
Yeah?
But probably not enough to get a real insight into it.
Do you have a sense of why it existed, why we were doing it? Do you remember anything about that?
I think it was in fairness to farmers that it was
Okay, all right.
in place.
Yeah, something wasn't right and the government helped fix it up. Who else remembers some conversation as a youth who's willing to have me come by and ask them. Oh, come on. You guys are farmers. You're not afraid of anything. Come on, come on. Somebody, say something. You want to say something?
I didn't drive from California. This is my first year here.
And that has what to do with
That
my
has
question?
nothing to do with it.
When did California start regulating milk prices, you remember?
I do not.
1960.
1960.
Yeah, were you alive then?
Not quite. No.
Not quite? Okay. So you remember talking about the California price regulation at all?
No, never
No?
heard of
Never heard of
it.
it? You're pulling my leg, right?
But I know what I would like to see is, as a probably a future farmer, would be like to see some the family farm to come back. That'd be kind of neat. My mom grew up on a family farm. I know that's somewhat kind of.
And what to you is a family farm?
I would say where the family's involved.
Okay, so 1,000 cow farm where the family's involved?
No, I mean it's not a matter of necessarily numbers, but bringing back to where the generation is involved. Like me, I have no clue
Okay.
about what let's say dairy or farming in general is all about.
Okay.
I'm a city boy from LA, and so to kind of bring city folks back to
Okay.
understanding what farming's all about, I think would be a very
That is a big goal in this room, I can tell you that right now. So people sit in the back because they figure they can be anonymous, but here I am, walking back here. So somebody back here raised their hand and admitted that they remembered hearing something about it. Now, I'm going to stand here until somebody fesses up. You don't count. Till somebody fesses up. Mary doesn't count either. Come on. Who's going to do it? I'm going to call on you now because.
You already talked to my husband.
I already talked to your husband?
Yeah.
You didn't grow up with your husband, though, did you?
Pardon?
You didn't grow up with your husband, though, did you?
No, since high school we did.
Yeah, okay. Do you remember anything from your own personal life about this? I mean, when you were a kid?
No, I guess not. He knows more than I did.
All right, okay, all right. How about you? John, I'm not going to ask you either. You grew up on a dairy farm? No. No, see, why bother with him? Okay, you, all right. This is not a normal person, but okay, we'll let Miss Knigge here have her say. That it was complicated. Like in a good way or a bad way, or? Yeah, my brain's full. How about perception of was it a good thing or a bad thing? Probably not. Yeah, so Minnesota, Wisconsin, it's kind of a deal. All right, so Mark is already thinking I'm taking him too much time, but the reason why I wanted to do this is because a lot of folks have opinions about federal orders. A lot of folks have ideas about why we have them and what they do. Dana gave you a whole bunch of things about what federal orders do that really didn't talk about setting minimum prices or establishing an average price that all farmers share in, at least as a minimum. And in fact, that's very true. There are a number of things that are done that try to calm the waters, try to give some sense of fair play, give some sense of everybody's got kind of a rule book. It's kind of like the black and white shirts, not preventing you from playing the game, but making sure you don't hit low, that you don't go off on a side, that there's some sense of a rule book that is absolutely fair to farmers, but also reasonable for the folks on the other side of the trade, that it's a reasonable proposition for buyers of milk, processors, and so on. The idea for this system, the law for this system came about in the 1930s. It kind of got a rough draft in the first Farm Bill in 1933, and then really got kind of more specifically finalized in 1937. But the idea of classified pricing and pooling as a way to create sort of a system that made some kind of sense was started by small-scale cooperatives in the New England area, which of course was earlier settled and had a big dairy industry, in the 1890s, 1890, 40 years before we actually had a federal law. 40 years, think about this. This is an adult working lifetime. The people that came up with this idea were long gone, probably, by the time we were starting to talk about this in Congress. By the time we were talking about this at the federal level, there were 60 cities, 60 cities in the United States that were doing classified pricing and pooling schemes of one type or another that were a private effort, that were organized by cooperatives on behalf of their farmers. When the S hit the fan in the 30s, Franklin Roosevelt, who had been governor of New York, a huge dairy state, who knew a lot of folks in the dairy community, asked for ideas. Co-ops primarily came forward. Farm organizations like the one Roger works for came forward and said, this is an idea that we think could be helpful to our producers. We found out that it didn't solve all the problems, but it is the one major dairy policy created in the 20th century that still exists and is still trying to calm those waters and be the guy in the black and white shirt. To be sure, everybody's got some idea about how something could be improved, and I think Dana would be the first to say, very open-minded to what improvements would look like. But also keep in mind, whatever it is that bugs you, if you thought about it, you'd probably think of 5 or 6 other things that actually you could recognize were pretty useful. So my pitch in response to Mark's question is, this is a thing that rose organically from within the dairy industry. It was not something that some politician made up to inflict pain upon dairy farmers anywhere in the US. And it's a living instrument that continues to be possible to adapt and change, and in fact, it's done a lot of adapting and changing over the years. A real challenge is it's a regionally based national system, so you kind of have to have sort of rules that are played similarly everywhere. You can't just have a Wisconsin rule, or you can't just have a Oregon rule or a Virginia rule, and so getting folks to agree on stuff, which seems to be a lot harder today than it used to be, is part of that challenge, but I think probably a challenge worth accepting and taking. Thanks.
Thank you, Andy. And for those of you who were personally traumatized by Andy back here in the audience, if you need a hug, let me know. I feel your pain because when I gave an answer that Andy didn't deem to be appropriate many years ago, he threw an eraser at me.
Sometimes you got to get attention.
Roger, I want to turn to you next. You've been working with and within federal milk marketing orders for a long period of time. Andy talked a little bit about the evolution, the culture that kind of brought some of the original ideas together. Federal orders are difficult to change substantially, but not impossible. The mechanism was certainly put in place to be able to make some changes, but maybe not wholesale changes to that. I'm going to ask you whether the problems that we had back in the 1930s and 40s, at the time that we actually pulled together much of what we think about as the machinery of federal orders, addresses the same problems we have today, or are those problems different?
I'm very happy to be here also, and the expo is a great event, and it's a pleasure to be up here with all 3 of these folks, and Mark. The problems, the federal orders did a good job addressing a lot of the problems that were faced in the 30s and 40s. It's easy to say we don't have some of those problems now, but it's because we've got a system that keeps us from having these problems. In some countries, sort of what Dana alluded to, in some countries, basically the supermarkets decide what the price of milk is for farmers. They decide when they're going to pay them, and they decide how things are going to flow and how work's going to be organized. In other commodities, we have very, very close supervision of growers by integrators in the broiler industry, for example. That's one way to do things. That's the way the markets worked it out. But the federal orders do a lot to help support individual farmers and co-ops of farmers. Co-op organization does a lot to help farmers run their farms the way they want to, and market their milk through an intermediary that they control. So I think that's all been important. It's also important that that the orders don't only operate for co-ops. They should operate for all producers. And over time, the market has changed in ways that have kind of forced us to rethink some of the calculations of pooling, for example. There used to be a lot of Class 1 milk. All the federal orders were organized around fluid milk markets. They were organized around city markets, and they were based on the idea that if you're not really serving a fluid market, you're not going to participate in the system. but over time with a very substantial amount of fluid milk, there was a lot of consolidation and growth, and we have these large regional federal orders, that really depended on a lot of fluid milk in each market. Now a lot of those markets don't have that much fluid milk. So things like what happened a couple of years ago where PPDs went crazy, it was a whole bunch of things that happened all at once. One of the big triggers was we didn't have enough block cheese capacity, which is a long, complicated story I won't get into now. Without that, it wouldn't have happened quite that way. But some of the effects were from the way some rules have been written. We have a pooling of 4 class prices, 2 of which are set or partially set based on prices that are 6 or 8 weeks old. You eliminate advanced pricing. That's one thing that could contribute to less volatility in PPD, more stable PPDs, more. What else? The system was, when it first got set up, it kind of worked until about 30 years ago. It really worked like a way to distribute the price support program fairly around the country. This price support program kind of set price levels. That also was something that it wasn't really built to handle the end of that and the volatility of the underlying prices. So, with the price support program not really having not existing anymore, and the volatility of the markets, then we need blend prices to kind of come together in a way that PPD doesn't get so volatile. I'm sorry, I have a couple of these things here. One of the things that could help also is the higher of class 1, going back to the higher of class 1. We have policy supporting a higher of and keeping the 74 cents. And one thing that would do is by adding more money into class 1, that would leave a little more wiggle room also for PPDs to stay positive. One of the things that has occurred to me, just me, is that so I'm not putting this on Farm Bureau, but it seems kind of straightforward. Is if the CME would introduce a class 1 contract, we wouldn't have to be fussing about how processors and producers could forward price class 1. If there was a class 1 contract, then that would be handled, and you wouldn't have to worry about risk management opportunities on the market when you design the class 1 formula. So
Sure.
I will stop at that.
Okay.
So that,
if you'd hand the
Jim has
microphone
time
to Jim. Jim's been around the dairy industry and federal orders for a long period of time. And more recently, you've actually been working with National Milk Producers Federation, with a few committees trying to take a look at federal orders and maybe what reform might be constituted. Roger mentioned 2 or 3 times that PPDs are a problem and maybe a couple of different ways that could be fixed. I want to ask you a straightforward question, but I want you to elaborate around that as well. Are PPDs a problem, or are PPDs the symptom of problems?
Okay. So let me first preface a couple things. I, like the rest of the group, appreciate the opportunity to be here at the expo along with these panelists. Let me also elaborate. You mentioned you're trying to herd cats. I just want to elaborate in terms of my position within National Milk. In every organization, there's a CEO, a CFO, COO, and so forth. I think my new position is CHO, Cat Herder Officer. And Mark mentions trying to herd us. Well, I'm trying to herd several different economists within the task force that National Milk has put together. In terms of the PPD and getting straight to that particular question, there's no question PPD and the negative and the depooling and so forth has been a real issue in many parts of the country. I say many parts of the country. One of my previous positions was with Southeast Milk. And most of us would say in the Southeast, what's a negative PPD? Because we're paid based upon fat and skim. Also, we have such a high utilization and a high class 1 differential that we very seldom get negative PPDs anyway, if it was connotated that way on the producer milk check. So let me get back to, in terms of national milk and our particular policy. Whenever we formed the task force, which was actually formed in January, we've been meeting on a regular basis. Mark, as you know, we formed 4 separate committees and so forth. PPDs is one of those issues we decided not to tackle because it's not really a national issue. Instead, we believe that individual markets should tackle those one-on-one, and if that means they need to tighten up pooling requirements or whatever they need to do, go do it that way. So we recognize whether it's agencies, separate co-ops, other organizations need to do it in that particular way. They need to handle it on that market-by-market basis. In terms of national milk and my particular position sitting up here, we're not handling it because we feel it is not a national issue. But there's no question. Some of the things that we are looking at within national milk, I think would reduce that PPD difference. And a good example is what Roger had already indicated. We're looking very seriously. It's not final yet. And let me preface that before all the writers start writing, well, National Milk believes in this and that and so forth. Nothing is final through national milk policy in terms of as it goes through the appropriate hierarchy. And things will be blessed here during the annual meeting, which is basically 2-3 weeks. At that particular time, the Board of Directors will vote on it. But we are very seriously proposing in front of the Board of Directors going to the higher of, reverting back to it. There's a couple other things that we're looking at, and I think time constraint, we probably can't get into all those other proposals, but that's our position on the PPD. Yes, it is an issue handled by a market-by-market basis.
Okay. You know, just out of curiosity, well, maybe the analogy for me would be I might go see my doctor and say, oh, boy, I've got a fever, 102. And if he tells me just take 2 aspirin and go home, you're fine. I'm going to say he addressed the symptom, he didn't address the problem. I've actually got, maybe an infection somewhere or something. He didn't bother looking at that. And I think the PPD is maybe an issue something like that. That's where we're seeing some of these issues, but express themselves. But it does get down to such things as pooling, as what I would suggest is maybe an issue and something we want to think about. If you go back just at the time of our last national reform around 2000, federal milk marketing orders were regulating something like 70% of the milk in this country. If you look at it today, it's more like what, Dana? 60? 60. Yeah, about 60%. And that's with the addition of California to the federal order system that wasn't there then. Substantial amount of milk. So we've actually got quite a bit less going on. I'd like the group to maybe talk a little bit, and I don't really care who this is directed to at first, and maybe Dana can take a swat at it, but is pooling a problem, and if so, what are some parameters that might be done to be thinking about pooling, keeping some milk in the order?
So I'm probably, it's on? Yeah, okay. So I'm probably not the right person to start this because an important role that we play at USDA is listening to the industry. And we come in as, if you want to, the referee in the game that's being played. And that game that's being played when it comes to pooling is between the Class 1 handlers who are required to be regulated. That's who we really focus in on, are the Class 1 handlers. It's a fluid milk focus program when it was established. That's where the emphasis has been. Class 2, 3, and 4 handlers, as I like to say, those are individuals who can either opt to play in the game or they can choose to step out of the game. And why do they do that? They do it because it's to their economic advantage. That's what it comes down to. Are they going to get money from the order, from the pool, or are they going to have to pay into it? And that's where the rub comes. That's what we saw some really unusual behaviors exerted during the pandemic. And it really brought home what milk should be pooled and should those pooling provisions be changed. I'm not here to tell you the answer to that. You in the industry are the ones who need to figure out that answer and bring it to USDA and then justify why it should be changed. I do think it is something that needs to be looked at on a regional basis. You cannot put in a provision across the entire US because if we sit here in the upper Midwest, Jeff knows this very well, very different market than what we see Jim worked with down in the Southeast. High class 1 down there, low class 1 up here. I think with the 2 plants that recently closed, we're down to about 5% class 1 use here in the upper Midwest. That needs a very different look than when we're looking in Florida and they're running about 80% class 1. So there are a lot of things that need to be looked at, but it needs to be done on an individual basis. And the industry needs to think about what provisions and who do they want to have to play and how much do they want to make them play. They make it harder for them to play, they want to make it easier for them to play. And that's up to the industry to decide.
Everybody's grabbing the microphone. Go ahead, Jim. But I guess that maybe one of the questions I would ask you to think about while you want to respond to Dana's thing is whether or not what we really have in place right now is a fluid milk solution to a manufacturing problem.
Let me just make a couple comments that really coincide directly with what Dana said. I fully agree. It needs to be handled on an individual order-by-order basis. There's no question you cannot have a national pooling standard throughout the country because each order is totally different, especially with its utilization and so forth. One of the things that does bother me in terms of the depooling and so forth, you know, when we look at especially upper Midwest, well, you're looking at a less than 10% class 1 utilization. So what value does the federal order ultimate become for dairy farmers? And I really question that. It becomes lesser and lesser value. In terms of my position at National Milk, just as long as my own personal opinion, federal orders have really served us well over the years. Now, are they perfect? No. And that's one of the reasons why, again, I'm punching a plug for National Milk, where we're looking at a modernization effort, not a reform effort, which reform connotates a tremendous change like what we went through in the year 2000. But in terms of making modernization efforts to change some of these things that hopefully will be able to continue the federal order program, and some of our efforts, again, will assist in this depooling issue. It's not directly related to, you know, on an individual order-by-order basis, but on a national basis.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks. Yeah, you can't do everything all at once. I think, Mark, when you sent the processing cost survey this spring, that sort of set folks going. That was the kind of the starting gun for everybody to come up with policy for federal orders and especially for price policy. And I think a lot of us are anticipating sometime next year that there'll be a federal order hearing addressing the 4 class prices, and I think hopefully class prices and class 1 differentials, which is a heavy lift all by itself. But there are a lot of regional issues like pooling standards and all those things that it's just too much to do all at once. So they can contribute to the depooling issues and the PPD issues. Certainly, the formula prices themselves are a factor in whether or not we have negative PPDs, as we've all talked about. The lag, the average of, and the lag in the class 1 price both contribute to PPD volatility, and we would love to see a more, if you have a market-oriented process, the class 3 and 4 prices ought to sort of converge in the long run. It's some special situations that sort of lead to big divergences, and I think as we look at the market going forward, and after years of believing class 3 would always be the highest, now that we have enough class 3 capacity, probably because an awful lot of pooled milk doesn't actually have to be paid the federal order minimum price, which is a For some folks is a dirty little secret, and for other folks is just a fact of life. An awful lot of manufactured milk in the federal order can be pooled and not paid the minimum. And so as the industry has adjusted, we've started to build, like the block plants got built out. They were in process before COVID hit. COVID kind of caught the industry with their pants down. They didn't have enough block capacity, and it blew up, and it created a kind of a unusual situation that wouldn't happen if COVID happened like it did. If the same thing happened in 2023, we would not have the kind of PPD problem that we had in 2020. It wouldn't be perfect, but it would be a lot different. So I think it's important not to worry too much about fighting yesterday's battles. It's important to look at what's going on going forward and fix things. We have, Farm Bureau hasn't always had a big role in federal order issues. I hand it to my predecessor as chief economist, John Newton, who came in with a lot of dairy background, and a bunch of our members got excited about the opportunity to really engage on dairy. We had several iterations of working groups to look at dairy policy. What they came up with entered into the mix. That group evolved, the recommendations evolved, but over time, a variety of policies went into the hopper in our policy process, which is very grassroots for those who don't know Farm Bureau well. National policy typically comes from a county Farm Bureau meeting where a policy proposal is offered, and if the county supports it, it gets passed along to the state. If the state resolutions folks, your committee likes it, it gets passed to the state delegates or board or membership vote on it, and it becomes a state policy. If they want to pass it along, if it's a potential national program, that gets passed along to AFBF, and through a committee process and a review process, it gets passed along ultimately to our delegates, which is a much broader group than our board. And policy we only support things if the membership broadly supports it. And we have now developed quite a amount of policy, quite a substantial amount of federal order policy, not so comprehensive that there's no room for discussion. Some of it is not so prescriptive that there isn't room to talk about it. And next week in Kansas City, we're having a conference, and Jim is going to be there, and Dana's going to be there. We're trying to bring everybody together to talk through the issues, specifically the stuff that we expect is going to be in the scope of the hearing next year on prices. We're going to try to avoid some of these regional issues that can just be divisive and aren't going to be talked about in next year's hearing anyway. So we're trying to be constructive, and we hope you show up too, Mark.
Well, you forget that I'm retired, or very nearly so. I really want Andy to try to kind of collect thoughts here on these last few questions and the comments we've had, and maybe bring us back to a little bit more focus, if you could.
So, Cornell University sits on the headwaters of a lake that's 40 miles long, 1 to 2 miles wide, and really deep. 478 feet is the steepest point. You can be 5 feet off a shore and be in 100 feet of water. This is a lot like federal orders. And I sort of feel like a lot of us just submerged into about 100 feet of water. And so I kind of want to step back a little bit, because pooling is a really fundamental and consequential question that can be looked at narrowly, but really has a lot of broad implications. It has implications for how prices are shared and who pays what, and a lot of different things. But fundamentally, the question of pooling is about who participates in the order and how easy it is to get on and off. It answers the question, who must participate? You don't have a choice. Who may participate? And how easy it is to change your mind if you're in the may group. As Dana said, this system historically has gone back to the notion that the guys who buy milk from farmers to put it into little packages and sell as a beverage to consumers are going to pay the highest price. You can't give them the choice. Raise your hand if you want to pay a higher price. So those guys must be part of it. They don't get to pick. Everybody else is more in a what have you done for me lately kind of group. Do you want to participate? Yes, I would, because participating means I get to share in the revenue that these higher priced guys are putting into the system. What do I have to do to participate? Just raise my hand and say, give me the money? Some places, actually, it's not a whole lot harder than that, but there are other places where you've got to do something. You've got to show an ability or willingness to deliver milk to these guys if they need it. The rules, as other speakers have said, vary around the country. In some places, it's pretty hard to get in. You've got to really do something. These are called performance standards. In other parts of the country, it's like come one, come all, pretty close. Does that make a difference? Well, yeah, it makes a difference. It makes a difference on how many people get their hands in the till when the class 1 guy is putting money in. How many fingers are drawing out? Is it good to make that hard? Or is it good to be generous and spread it around? You be the judge of that. That's not for me to say. But that's a very fundamental question. Do you need to do something to earn this participation, or is this come one, come all? I'll make the observation that under the old California state order system, which was in place for 40 years, they had what was called mandatory pooling. Every drop of milk sold commercially in the state of California was going to be part of their pricing system. They shared in the responsibility, and they shared in the benefits of having this sort of weighted average, so-called pooled price. When they came along and asked USDA to work with them on changing their system from a state system to a federal system, there were a lot of voices out there that said, oh, and by the way, we think you should have mandatory pooling, just like we do now. They asked for several other things that were consistent with what they'd done under California, but not at all consistent with what we've done under federal milk marketing orders. USDA came back and said, you would be the only one in the country that had mandatory pooling. That is not part of our culture. We're not going to approve that. Coincidentally, curiously, what is it now? 1/3, pushing towards half of the milk in California does not participate in the California federal milk order system. These are the guys that said, force me to do it, and then said, oh no, change my mind, don't want to. So was it good that they had that flexibility? I'm thinking the guys that got out did so because they wanted to. So at least from their perspective, that was a good thing. So that's the question we're talking about with pooling. The other question is, okay, if I'm in the I maybe group, I'm not required, how easy is it for me to get in and out? Do I go up to the market administrator and say, I changed my mind, I don't like the prices this month, so count me out? And you go, okay, sure, whatever you like. And then 2 months later you go, I like the prices now, I want to come back. Or should it be, okay, you got to earn your way back, like you had to earn your way into the first place? That there's consequences from deciding to opt out. You want to opt out and stay out? If you're in the maybe group, hey, knock yourself out. Do you want to just kind of flip in and out whenever it suits your purpose? Or is there a consequence to say, well, if you're going to be out, you can come back, but it's probably going to take you, it's going to be a little hard for you to come back. That's a big question. And frankly, the latter one, the flipping back and forth, really was one of the big contributors to this issue of negative producer price differentials, trying to avoid it when you didn't want it and trying to come back when it was to your favor. So this is a critical question, and it's a fundamental question. Should we be generous? Everybody plays? Should we be saying, no, you have to earn your way in? And should the answer be different in Florida than it is in Minnesota? Everybody's here saying it's an order-by-order thing. But then you have folks saying, well, I got to do this in my area, and you don't have to do anything. So, okay, is one size fits all, and we're all good with that, or not? So pooling is a really important question, and it's not super simple, like nothing with federal orders is super simple, but it's one that we should really try to understand, and understand it has different dimensions that contribute to how the system works and how the people who are part of the system play the game.
Okay. You know, we could not only spend the rest of this hour, but the rest of this day and probably week talking about pooling alone, but I'd like to, you know, throw a little bit of some other ideas out for the group to chew on. One of them is just the changes that we've seen in our dairy system. We still produce milk in all 50 states, not very much in some. California, or not California, California produces a lot, but I was going to say Alaska and Hawaii still have a dairy farm or two each, not many. Enough so that they don't even report the milk production statistics in NAS anymore. But we're seeing regions, states, seemingly specializing into or out of milk production. So it's not just like almost everywhere now. We're down below 30,000 dairy farms in the country. Concentration is happening a lot and still producing more milk than ever. Is this a problem or an issue with federal milk marketing orders and the way we try to move milk around to meet the needs that the system has? I suspect it is, but you know, getting milk to move from point A to point B is a difficult thing. Who wants to take a pass at that? Jim does. Jim does.
Thank you, Andy. Yeah, I've moved more than one load of milk in my day. So is it a problem? Absolutely. There's no question. We have seen tremendous changes, not only in the milk production side, but also on the cheese capacity, on the Class 1 plants continuing to close, just on both sides of the equation, as well as demand driving a large part of that as well. Just recently, no question, diesel fuel is really changing the dynamics of how milk needs to flow from one region to the next region. Trying to find adequate milk haulers, stainless steel to move the milk. We've got a lot of factors. And that's one of the things that, again, a plug for National Milk, that we're trying to modernize some of these things, because in many cases, a good example are the protein are the coefficients that are in the formulas. They haven't been changed in 22 years, Mark, as you well know. Class 1 price surface needs to be changed, because in order to get the milk to where it's needed, and that's really what the purpose of the the whole federal order program, we're looking very diligently at how those Class 1 differentials or Class 1 price surface should be changed. We're actually commissioning a study to take a good hard look at that. It's basically the same modeling, but much more comprehensive, that was put together in the latter 90s that developed the 2000 federal order reform. So we're taking a look at that. Now, when I say that, that's the scientific part of it. When I say the scientific, that's what the model says. Well, those of us who've moved milk, there's rivers and there's bridges and there's other boundaries and so forth. We're taking a good hard look, and there's several of us representing the National Milk, and basically we're the economists representing 16 different co-ops. We're taking a good hard look and making sure that the scientific part meets the art form as well. We call ourselves, you'll appreciate this, the Colored Pencil Crew, where we're looking at all 3,100 counties and trying to re-examine the current Class 1 price surface in those counties and what it should be, given all the dynamic changes that have occurred in the last 22 years.
Yeah, and it's 3,108 counties.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mark.
You know, Class 1 differentials.
I don't think, I mean, if the question, maybe I heard the question wrong, but I don't think that concentration in dairy is a function of the federal orders. I think quite the opposite.
No, I didn't say that.
Okay,
No,
but
didn't
let me make the point then anyway. Yeah, I think there would be a lot more concentration in dairy if it weren't for the federal orders. So.
I wouldn't disagree with that. But I think that one of the things I'd like to follow up on with some of you folks, maybe Jim's the most adequate person to talk about this, but Class 1 differentials by themselves are not big enough to move milk. And in point of fact, if they were, then I think we would have a lot of milk moving to where it didn't need to be. They only encourage milk to move in the right direction. Am I right about that? And if so, why do you even worry about it then if they're not big enough to cover the cost?
You're absolutely correct. The Class 1 price surface is not adequate enough to pay the full amount. Dairy producers usually end up paying the difference. However, we need an adequate Class 1 price surface to assist in that movement. And that's how we're really taking a look, because those differentials or those Class 1 price surfaces haven't been changed, as I indicated, in 22 years. So if we can get at least some of that money back to help enhance us to be able to move the milk, that will assist. The other thing that has really changed in the marketplace is, especially those of us who've been involved in overorder agencies, overorder premiums, that's been a tremendous change. A good example, as I indicated, I was in the Southeast. I was located in Florida. We were known for some of the highest Class 1 prices in the country for years, if not decades. Well, the overorder price surface has really deteriorated over the last several years. In fact, it's very, if not zero, pretty darn close to zero throughout most parts of the country. And in some places, yeah, 50 cents, 75 cents, something like that. But that's not enough to move the milk to where it's needed. In my opinion, some of the other areas where some of the orders assist in that by providing other incentives, transportation credits is a good example in some orders, where the processors are actually forking up additional dollars within the pool. Those people who demonstrate by servicing the Class 1 are able to capture those dollars to return those back to the haulers to get the money for where the milk is needed.
You know, those Class 1 differentials, they're not just to move milk, they're to sustain local supplies as well. It's very important that the deficit areas, places like the Southeast, places where it's tough to supply milk, that they have Class 1 differentials that are high enough to help sustain that local production. It's not all about moving, and I don't think Jim disagrees. I think it's just he's as a guy who had to manage logistics, he thinks about moving the milk. But maintaining that local production, it really demands adequate Class 1 differentials. That's why it's important to relook at those.
No, I don't disagree with that at all. I mean, we have to have an adequate milk price to get milk into the door of a plant. If we can encourage it to be produced locally, that's great. If we need to attract it down from a further distance, then that's also part of the plan. Dana, I want to ask you a question. Part of what we do with milk, or have done with milk, is to follow it to its end use, and then think about how we get those prices or values back to the producers that produce the milk in the first place. It's not just structure that's changed. Where milk's being produced, on what farms, in which regions of the country, or where people are choosing to move. It's also about what we can do technologically with dairy products now. It's being separated into all kinds of components, and bits and pieces of milk are going in different directions, not necessarily the same class. Can you follow it? Is this a problem? Do you worry about that? Do you simplify it? What?
So fortunately, we have a great staff of market administrator employees that follow every drop of milk, which is good. Every drop of milk, I'll say, that is pooled. And that's the key thing. We're dealing and we're concerned about the milk that is pooled. Currently, we have 4 classes of milk. In the history of the program, there have been 3 classes of milk. You can talk to many people. They'll say, you know what, because of all the product differentiation that's going on that you've talked about, Mark, we should have 7 classes of milk. Or others articulate we should have 2 classes of milk. There are a lot of new products on the market. Sometimes federal orders are often criticized because we prevent innovation. I'm not sure I understand that particular argument, because I look, and if you look around, look at your local grocery store, you're going to see all sorts of new dairy products that are out there. And we do have the ability to follow and track that milk through our audit process, which again, this is important because it comes back to getting that full value and how is that milk used. And we have a classified pricing system. All of this conversation goes back to what Andy was originally talking about. We have a 1937 Act, and in that act, it's very, very prescriptive in some ways, in that it says that there will be classified pricing. And we have determined that classified pricing right now to consist of fluid milk, and then we have your soft products, and then we have your more storable products. And each one of them, if they're in order, Obviously, it makes sense fluid is the highest and your storable products are the lowest because they can be maintained for a longer period of time. And I think this is, it's an important piece of the order system. As far as innovation, it needs to continue. Should the orders adapt to that innovation? Again, I leave that up to the industry to determine. Should we go to 7 classes of milk? Oh. Might be a little more challenging for our employees to follow that through. But it is important for us to understand and to make certain that all of the the milk that is pooled is accounted for, and we can do that.
Andy, I want to give you a shot here at asking a different kind of question. Federal orders have a process for reform within the framework of what we currently have. And yet I think there are a lot of things that we've talked about that we might want to consider as far as reform goes that would really require an act of Congress to make that happen. What's within the ballpark of what we might expect in the way of a federal order hearing, and what's kind of outside the ballpark?
So there's, I think, maybe 3 different layers here. One is, what is really specific to a particular milk marketing order area? What is particular to the Southeast? What is particular to the area we call Central, et cetera? And can that be dealt with just within that local framework? Or maybe a couple adjacent ones, but locally, not nationally. What are things that really need to be thought about in a system-wide basis? National isn't probably quite the right word because it isn't every geographic area, but there is a network of marketing orders that spans the country. And what needs to be considered nationally? The question that Mark is particularly asking is, what can you do within the rule book you currently have, and what kinds of things would you need some new rules? So a lot of the issues, the hearings that were done historically, were localized. And there was this attitude of, well, that's a Tennessee thing. That doesn't matter to us. More and more since the 1990s, which for some of you seems a long time ago, but isn't really all that long ago, more and more things started to feel more national, started to feel more like we can't just do this in one place. How many classes of milk can we have? Well, it used to be not every order had the same number of classes, but now we feel like, yeah, that doesn't make sense. We should all have the same classes. And other payment dates. You know, should we have different payment dates in Minnesota than we have in Oklahoma? That doesn't make any sense. So often now we find ourselves saying this is really a national question. National questions tend to be a lot more outside the box. And so there are things like, could we do this or could we do that? And actually, there's some folks within the South building who wear the hat that says, I know the rule book, talk to me. And a lot of times you go talk to that person, it's like, yeah, we really couldn't do that without a rule. The higher of thing was a good example of that. Could we have gone to a federal order hearing to reconsider how Class 1 prices are established in relationship to the foundational classes 3 and 4? Could we have had that hearing? Answer, yes, we could have had that hearing. For whatever reasons, not my cross to bear or explain, it was decided, let's do this legislatively instead. Maybe that goes faster. Maybe we're more certain of the outcome. Maybe whatever, maybe. That was done. Did it have to be done? No, but it was. I think we should have mandatory pooling. Could we talk about that as a national federal order hearing? And the high priestess of the USDA rulebook would say, yeah, no. There is no provision in the 1937 Agricultural Marketing Agreement Act that would allow us to even talk about mandatory pooling. You want to do that? You have to change the order. So there are a number of things where new legislation would be required in order for USDA to think about that. My only, and we can get more specific if you want, but my only comment on that, block voting would be another example of that. Block voting is permitted. It's not required. It's simply permitted in the act now. You didn't want to do that? That would be a legislative thing. It's in the act. It's not something that Dana made up. My only final comment would be careful what you ask for. Think this through really quickly. The folks that said, hey, I got this great idea. We're gonna do like the average plus 74 cents, and most of the time that's gonna be great. And then they found out there's sometimes that really sucked big time. So you really want to think through whether or not that's a good idea before you just go run off and see your favorite congressman.
Okay, I'm going to just say the first shall be last. Dana, we've come to the end of our time period here that we're supposed to be in this session. I think we could all go a lot longer, but quick question, and I think it's going to be a really quick answer because I suspect I know. Any insights as to the timeline of when we may be having a hearing? And importantly, if you care to explain what it means, what will the scope of the hearing be?
Okay, it's time for us to all leave now. So if I could project the timeline when I expect to get a proposal in, I'll buy a lottery ticket and we'll all be happy. Based on the industry conversations, I would anticipate that there would be some type of proposal submitted in for a national hearing next year. I believe it'll probably be maybe in the first half of the year. I'm not going to say if it's the fiscal year or the calendar year or whatever. I've been in Washington for a little while, so I'm dancing on that answer, Mark.
That's perfect.
But I do think that based on the conversations and on the will of the industry to want to move forward, that probably there'll be something submitted. Do I think it'll be as comprehensive as what maybe the whole industry would like to have? I'm not sure that it will be. I just think that there are a lot of tentacles that are being extended out there as you get into the issues and as you talk about them. It's kind of like, okay, can we make this change? Can we make that change? A couple of them talked about here. A lot of controversy about why we went to the average, right? Let's move back to the higher of. Okay, well then they say if you're going to open up class 1 and you're going to go back to the higher of, well, maybe we should look at class 1 differentials. Well, that suddenly adds another layer. It adds another topic, and I think we're beginning to see that. You know, yeah, let's look at make allowances. Oh, maybe we should look at the composition of the milk. You know, maybe we should go a little bit further in those formulas. Maybe there are other things. So that's why I believe the timeline is going to be a little bit longer than what I think some in the industry would like. But I'm trying to be a realist. Once we get a proposal in, then the secretary will do an evaluation. And, you know, we look at everything that has been presented. And basically at that point, the secretary will decide how far he wants to go and what he wants to hear in that, or as Mark said, what the scope is, how we frame the hearing. And that is a key thing, because when we frame the hearing, those are the topics we're going to discuss. And those are the only topics that will be allowed to be presented. And one of the points I want to make real strongly today is that there is a hearing process that was designed to be very transparent. And it's a process that's designed to let all interested parties participate, either coming to the hearing and testifying, submitting in comments, making suggestions, submitting in proposals. I'm certain the secretary will ask for additional proposals once we get that in. And it's really important. It's an opportunity for everyone who has an interest to be able to participate. This is one of the few processes that's very transparent and really encourages that to happen. And if I were a handler or a dairy producer, I'd want to make certain I have some input into what my future is going to look like. So he will limit the scope to some degree. How far that's limited depends on the proposal that comes in and how well developed it is. That's the other thing. There has to be evidence. The decisions that are made, the orders that we currently have are based on evidence that's been submitted. And that, again, goes to transparency within the process. I can't suddenly pull a magical make allowance number out of the air and say, whew, this is what it is. It doesn't happen that way. USDA will make a decision based on all of the data that's been entered and all of the facts that have been presented. And then that's how it is. And that's the basis of the orders that we have. And they're there to be changed. You know, people like to say, Mark, they're archaic. You know, they're old. Geez, they were put in the 37, like Andy said. Whew. You know, that's really old. I wasn't born then. Neither were you. But so anyway, we're good that way. But they've changed. They change continually. And they evolve continually to adapt. And this is a time that they need to evolve again. But it's going to be based on what the industry comes forward with, what the industry is willing to put the factual evidence into the record on, and then we at USDA will evaluate it. And most importantly, the producers will determine whether or not they go in place and whether or not those changes happen.
Well, I want to thank you very much. And if I were grading you, I would probably give you, Dana, maybe a B+, possibly an A-, because you were very eloquent and didn't actually answer the questions that I asked. So that was ideal. No, but thank you. Actually, yeah. I want to actually thank all of you folks for participating today. There's a lot of knowledge and information about the dairy industry up here. It's going to be a long, interesting road, I think, ahead of us, and we appreciate you coming to listen to this portion of it. So I suspect folks will be up here for a little while, and we probably still have some access to the room if you want to come and ask some questions. So thank you very much.
Very briefly,